Chapter 5, The Induced Transition. Do not absorb negative information. The generation shift. People have always hankered after the good old days. With age, life somehow seems to get worse. People turn to reminiscing about their youth and times when the colors were richer, first impressions more vivid, dreams attainable. Music was better, the climate more favorable, people were more approachable, and meat was more tender, to say nothing of their health. Life was full of hope, pleasure, and joy. Once a certain number of years have passed, people begin to sense that events do not make them as happy as they did before. Picnics, parties, concerts, films, celebrations, dates, warm seawater. From an objective point of view, all these things are still pretty much the same quality as they were before. Parties are still fun, films are still interesting, and seawater still feels warm. Nonetheless, life is not the same as it used to be. The colors have faded, our responses have dulled, and enthusiasm has waned. Why is it that everything is so much more wonderful when we are younger? Can it really be that our perception of things loses its sharpness as we grow older? We do not lose the ability to laugh, cry, perceive taste and color, distinguish truth from deceit, or differentiate between good and bad, just because we are a little older. So, could the world gradually be going downhill? No, the world is not deteriorating. Things only seem to getting worse to certain people. What actually happens is that a person shifts to a negative lifeline that runs in parallel with former lifelines, where everything is just as fine now as it was before the individual left them behind. By expressing dissatisfaction, a person attunes themselves to lifelines that draw them in and where things genuinely are worse than before. According to the principle of transurfing, the alternative space has everything for everybody. In one sector, the colors of life have become gray, while in another life remains as bright and cheery as it always was. A person who emanates negative thought energy ends up drawn into a sector with a different type of scenery, but the world remains the same for everyone else. This is true not only in extreme cases in which someone has become an invalid, lost their home, their loved ones, or become an alcoholic and ruined their life. In most cases, during the course of their life, a person regularly slides onto lifelines where the colors of the scenery are duller than they were on the previous lifeline. When this happens, a person begins to reminisce about how vivid and fresh everything was years ago. When a child is born, they accept the world the way it is. A child is unaware of the fact that life could change, becoming better or worse. Young people have not yet been spoiled, and so they are less picky. They are still busy with the task of discovering the world for themselves and enjoying life because they have more hope than cause for complaint. They think that life is pretty much okay and expect it to get even better. With time, they experience misfortune and failure and begin to understand that not all dreams come true, that some people are better off, and that they have to fight for their place in the sun. As time goes by, they can end up with more cause for complaint than hope. Discontentment and whining become a moving force that pushes a person onto unsuccessful lifelines. Expressed in transurfing terms, this type of person radiates negative energy, which transfers them onto lifelines that correspond to the negative parameters of their own thought energy. life is less satisfactory the worse you think it to be. Children rarely contemplate whether their childhood is good or not. As children, we take everything for granted. We have only just begun discovering the world and have not yet acquired the habit of criticism. The greatest insult we experience as children is not being bought a much-wanted toy by a relative. It is only as we get a little older that we start to resent the world around us for fulfilling us less and less. The more we complain, the worse things are as a result. Everyone who has survived their youth and reached a mature age will say that a lot of things were better when they were younger. That is the paradox. You come up against circumstances that disappoint you, and so you express your dissatisfaction, which then aggravates the situation even more. Your discontent comes back to you like a triple force boomerang. Firstly, the excess potential created by your discontent turns balanced forces against you. Secondly, your discontent serves as a channel through which a pendulum being can draw on your energy. Thirdly, radiating negative energy, you shift onto lifelines of a corresponding vibration. The habit of reacting negatively is so deep-seated that human beings are beginning to lose their advantage over other creatures further down the food chain in their capacity for awareness. An oyster also reacts negatively to external irritants. But unlike the oyster, a human being is able to consciously and intentionally regulate their relationship with the external world. Nevertheless, most people do not use the benefit of awareness, instead responding aggressively to the slightest inconvenience. Aggression is mistakenly interpreted as strength, but in fact, a person who chooses to express themselves aggressively might as well, metaphorically speaking, be quivering helplessly in a pendulum's web. You might think that life is not as good as it used to be, but the younger generation happens to think that life is wonderful. Maybe they just do not know how great things were when you were their age. Having said that, when you were young, the older generation complained about life too and reminisced about the good old days. This pattern cannot simply be explained by the tendency of the human psyche to erase all negative memories, leaving just the positive ones. The criticism is aimed at the present moment, which is supposedly worse than it used to be. If you accept the fact that life is getting worse with every passing year, then you would have to agree that the world should have simply fallen to pieces a long time ago. An uncountable number of generations have passed since the beginning of human history, and each one believes that life's colors have faded. Many an old man will tell you with absolute certainty how much better Coca-Cola used to be. Coca-Cola was invented in 1886. Imagine how disgusting Coke must be by now if it has been consistently worsening in quality since then. Or perhaps one's sense of taste weakens with age, although that is hardly the case. Anyway, the old man will probably tell you how everything else is of a poorer quality today too, be it furniture, clothes, or any other item. If the world were the same for everyone, after several dozen generations, life would have become a nightmare for everybody. So how should we understand the paradoxical statement that the world is not the same for everyone? We all live in the same world, comprised of the material realization of alternative lifelines. And yet, every individual experiences a different possible alternative. On the surface of things, there are obvious differences in people's fate. Some are rich, some are poor, some are successful, and some are struggling. Some are lucky, and some unlucky. We all have our own personal reality within the common world we live in. It seems quite straightforward, just as there are rich and poor neighborhoods in a single town. The script, role, and the scenery differ in different manifestations of reality. The difference in scenery is harder to track. One person looks at the world from the window of their luxurious car, whilst another peeks at it from inside a rubbish container. One person enjoys the party, whilst another is consumed in thought about their problems. One sees a group of happy youths, another at a gang of hooligans. They are all looking at the same things, but the images they perceive differ as black and white film differs from color. Every individual is attuned to their own sector in the alternative space, and so everyone lives in their own personal world. All these worlds exist in layers that exist one on top of the other, forming what we understand to be the space we live in. It might be difficult to imagine, but no one layer can be separated from another. Every individual creates their own reality, and that reality intersects and interacts with the rest of the world around us. Imagine what the earth was like before any single living creature existed. Winds blow, rains fall, volcanoes erupt, and rivers flow. Then suddenly, a person is born who begins to observe their environment. The energy of that person's thoughts stimulates the material manifestation of a certain sector of the alternative space, which represents their specific life in this specific world. That person's life represents a new layer in the world. Then another person is born who generates another layer. One person dies, and a layer disappears, or perhaps is transformed depending on what happens beyond the threshold of death. We are vaguely aware that other forms of life exist in parallel worlds of some kind. Let us suppose for a moment that there are no living creatures in these worlds whatsoever, at least not yet. What kind of energy would stimulate the material manifestation of space that contained no single living creature? We can only guess. Perhaps, once the last living creature dies, the world itself will disappear. Who can prove that the world exists if there is nobody in it? For if there are no people who would be around to say that the world, in our understanding, exists at all, there would be no world to speak of. That is enough speculation for now. We do not want to get bogged down in abstract conjecture. Remember, though, that transurfing is just one of many models. All existing theories about the world and life in it are nothing but models. Remember also the notion of importance, and try to avoid projecting any outer importance onto the transurfing model of the universe. Otherwise, you could become an apologist for futile ideas and try proving to everyone the truth of your own subjective worldview. Truth is an abstract notion, for we can only understand some of the world's forms and laws. Our goal here lies exclusively in attaining maximum practical benefit from our preferred model of the universe. Now let us return to the topic of the generations. Throughout their lifetime, a person reattunes their energy from the vibration of one sector in the alternative space to another, thereby transforming the layer of their personal world. The more a person readily expresses their discontent, emanating large quantities of negative energy, the more strongly the tendency for the quality of their life to deteriorate is consolidated. A man could acquire great material wealth with age, but not necessarily be any the happier for it. The colors of his scenery could just as well fade, and life become less enjoyable. The older and the younger generation both drink the same Coca-Cola, swim in the same oceans, ski on the same mountain slopes, and everything is pretty much the same as it was many years ago. However, the older man is convinced that in his day, everything was better, and the young person is convinced that things are better now. And when the young person grows old, the story will no doubt repeat itself. There are deviations from this tendency, both for the better and for the worse. Sometimes, a person only begins to develop a taste for life as they get older, and the opposite can happen. A successful young man can go downhill until he hits rock bottom. That said, in general, the generations agree that life gets worse as you get older. This is how the shift in generational layers takes place. The layer of the older generation shifts to a lifeline of poorer quality, and the layer of the younger generation gradually follows on behind. The shift takes place gradually, each time starting from a point of optimism. This is precisely why the world as a whole never actually transforms into a living hell. Everyone has their own layer, which they choose themselves. By now, you will have a clear picture of how the choice can be made to one's personal detriment. In previous chapters, we have already talked about how to avoid creating a living hell in your own life layer. You may also wonder whether it is possible for a person to retrieve an earlier section of their world or return to a lifeline that was filled with color and hope like it was in childhood. The transurfing technique can help with this task, but before we look at that, it is first useful to understand how exactly a person can end up shifting from a lifeline full of success and hope to a lifeline where they would face the question, so how exactly did your life end up like this?